area. And then we also have Amber Miller with Delta Dental. So welcome to Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee. Committee, on our agenda today, we have House Bill 2101, and we will ask Eileen to give us a bill brief. Senator Holscher, do you have an announcement?
Yes, I would just like to introduce my pages, if I may.
Feel free.
Great. Today I have Esther from Shawnee Mission East, as well as Anya from Prairie Star Middle School, and Marin, also from Shawnee Mission East. Welcome.
Welcome. We're glad you're here. Okay, back to 2101. Eileen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for your patience this morning. House Bill 2101 regulates contract for deed transactions, authorizes recording of contracts for deeds or affidavits of equitable interest. It lists deceptive practices constituting violations of the Consumer Protection Act, requires notice to the buyer of default, and it allows buyers to cure such default. So House Bill 2101 would enact 4 new sections of law to be known as the Kansas Contract for Deed Act. Section 1 provides the names of the act and definitions of terms used throughout the act. Section 2 provides that any contract for deed or affidavit of equitable interest may be recorded in the office of the County Register of Deeds where the property is located by any interested person. Section 3 prohibits a seller from executing a contract for deed with a buyer if the seller does not hold title to the property. A seller shall maintain fee simple title to the property free of any mortgage, lien, or other encumbrance for the duration of the contract for deed, subject to certain exceptions listed in the section. And a violation of Section 3 is a deceptive act or practice under the Kansas Consumer Protection Act and shall be subject to the enforcement provisions of that act. Section 4 provides that a buyer's right under a contract for deed shall not be forfeited or canceled except as provided in that section, notwithstanding any provision in the contract providing for forfeiture of buyer's rights. The buyer's rights under a contract for deed shall not be forfeited until the buyer has been notified of the intent to forfeit and has been given a right to cure the default, and such buyer has failed to do so within the time period allowed. Timely tender of cure shall reinstate the contract for deed. This section also provides the form for the form of a notice of default and intent to forfeit, and how such notice of default and intent to forfeit shall be served on a buyer. Nothing in this section shall be construed to preclude the buyer or any seller from pursuing other remedies. And the House Committee on Financial Institutions and Pensions amended the bill to insert additional criteria by which a seller could qualify for an exemption from the liability prohibition, which would require that the seller disclose the contract for deed to the liability interest holder and require that the seller obtain a release of any outstanding liabilities on the property prior to the buyer's final payment. The bill passed the House Committee of the Whole on a vote of 118 to 1, and if enacted, this bill would take effect on July 1st of this year, and I can stand for questions.
Eileen, thank you very much. Committee, are there questions? See none, thank you. We will now turn our attention to the proponents. First up, we have Representative Jason Prost, Kansas House of Reps. Welcome, Jason. It's good to see you over on the, I was going to say good side, but the other side.
I guess it depends on the day, right? Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members. I'm glad to be here to testify on 2101 today, and thankful to the work that's been done on the House side. I worked closely with Chairman Hoheisel on this. I'm going to give you just a little bit of history on this legislation. This is about 5 years in the making. My experience with this goes back further, but legislatively, we introduced a piece of legislation about 5 years ago that really simply said, we want to make sure that if somebody buys a house on land contract or a house is sold on land contract or contract for deed, that you can file an affidavit of equitable interest. That was a very simple thing that we wanted to do, but the committee thought we should take it to the Judicial Council and do some work on it. So we spent a summer with the Judicial Council working through that, and that was an interesting process that I had never been through before, where we had people from the banking industry, the real estate industry, a lot of real estate attorneys working together to come up with good law on this. And what you have in front of you in 2101 is the product of what the Judicial Council produced. I first became aware of this being a problem probably back around 2007, 2008 during the financial crisis when we had a lot of issues with housing. And in my town, what we found is there were people who were buying houses on land contract and then reselling them on land contract, and then, or they were selling a house on land contract that they had a mortgage on. They were taking payments from people and then not making the payments on the mortgage. And then when they would default, the bank could go try to figure out what was going on and find out they have tenants in there. It's a really unregulated area of law. We don't have any law governing real estate contracts for deed. We have it, if you're a renter, you're protected by the Landlord-Tenant Act. If you buy a house and you can access traditional lending and traditional mortgages, you're protected by all the provisions that are included in, financing laws and lending laws and inspections and things of that nature. But if you and I want to enter into a contract to buy and sell a house, there's nothing that even resembles any oversight on that. We could draw up a contract on a piece of scratch paper, and that's the contract. And a lot of people get exploited on this. So this, and if I will say this, if you live in any urban area at all, this is probably happening. And one thing I tell people is it's hard to quantify, because people who get taken advantage of in this way usually are in a crisis and they just have to go find another place to live. So they don't usually have the legal savvy or the finances to go try to get legal recourse. They usually just have to pack up and go find another place to leave, and they lose their investment. On the House side, I did have an attorney and a family that come testify. The schedules didn't work to get them up here this time, but he took to court and won a judgment for this family who had experienced just this. They had purchased a house on land contract, put $10,000 down, paid $1,000 a month. Took them about 6 months to make the house habitable. They did a lot of work on it, replaced windows, doors, air conditioning, things like that. And at the end of that, they've come to find out that the person they'd been paying didn't actually have title to the home. So they actually never had the right to sell the home. So they lost all their money, and they got a judgment from the court that said, yeah, you were wronged, but there was really no financial recumbrance on that. So the bill, the revisor did a great job explaining, but the bill just provides a few simple protections. One of the main ones being that you can't sell a home on land contract if you don't have clear title, and if you do have an encumbrance on it, you have to be clear about that, and you have to be open about that, and then and you have to get permission of the buyer. It's just a matter of making sure that it's all disclosed. And if you're not honest about that and you're not disclosing that, then it triggers a deceptive act under the Consumer Protection Act, and it allows us to intervene and try to get some recourse for people. I will say another thing, if people are doing land contracts the proper way, this law won't affect them at all. And I want to say that land contracts can be a good tool for people who can't access traditional credit. If they have damaged credit, or they have minimum resources, or they have another barrier that prevents them from accessing traditional lending, land contracts can be a good tool. And for people who are doing this responsibly, they're probably filing the title at an escrow company, and they're probably running the payments through an escrow company. But the ones that hope to exploit people aren't doing that. They're running a contract, and they're taking the payments, and there's no way to know that they're not being upfront about everything. So to me, the real value in this is that it just creates a little bit of oversight, and it says you can file an affidavit of equitable interest. We couldn't agree on the Judicial Council about who needed to do that. But in the case of the family in Wichita that I was referencing earlier, they had a provision in their contract that said you cannot file an affidavit of equitable interest, which prevented them from finding out that somebody else had an interest in the property. So my belief is that 2101 is a good way to protect both consumers. It doesn't interfere too onerously with people who are doing this correctly. And it also protects lenders, because one of the issues we do have is that lenders have no way to know that somebody is is selling a house on contract. So I think it protects a lot of different interested parties in this and takes some of the bad actors out of the system, or at least creates some regulation for them. And I would be happy to stand for any questions you might have.
Representative, thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, are there questions? Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative, for your testimony today. And I understand the purpose for the bill, and in my experience, in my practice, I do deal with both sides of the issue, both the seller and the buyer. And what often happens is sometimes the buyer doesn't execute and continue to pay on the contract. And then the buyer, though, has filed an affidavit of equitable interest, which is recorded with the Register of Deeds and then is on the title. And the seller then, you haven't been paying me, buyer, and you now have clouded my title to my property. And how do it's very difficult to get the affidavit of equitable interest cleared up without, for instance, a lawsuit to clear the title, which is expensive for the seller. And I don't see anything in this bill that would help with the situation where the buyer simply isn't paying to clear up that affidavit of equitable interest. No requirement that the buyer release the affidavit of equitable interest and file that with the Register of Deeds. So what does the bill provide? Because you said it provides protections for everybody, and I kind of see a seller in that situation left with a cloud on their title from a buyer who's not paying.
Thank you. It's a good question. I had thought that we put an amendment on the House side that I thought maybe addressed that, and maybe I'm not understanding exactly what we did on that. But that's a fair point. I mean, I think if there's a complication with getting the title cleared up, like I said, I thought we had created a provision that said we could, but if that's something that needs to be discussed, I don't have an issue with that. That's a fair point that if buyers do default, and there needs to be a path to remedy on that. And that could be part of the curing process, that if you don't cure the contract, that there's a way to remove that affidavit.
Well,
there's also I'm sorry, we're also not requiring, we're just saying that a Register of Deed has to accept it. But the other part of this that we talked about is trying to do a more organic education about the value of filing an affidavit of equitable interest, just to make sure people are aware of that tool.
Sure, and we want to make sure that false affidavits of equitable interest aren't filed either. So when a buyer thinks they have a contract and they file it and then they're mistaken, and I'm involved in a case where clients about that right now. So just need to make sure we're clear. And I would like to see some mechanism that if you, the buyer, despite the notice and despite your trying to cure, you just haven't, I would think we would want to put some obligation on the buyer to clear up the title and to remove the affidavit of equitable interest. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Cluse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I appreciate this. I think this is something that's needed. I've had a lot of real estate background. The question I have is, so contract for deed, I understand residential, land, this would flow over into commercial. I mean, there's a lot of commercial stuff too, or it wouldn't.
That's a good point. This is restricted only to residential. We recognize that in agriculture and in commercial, there's a lot of value in contract for deed, and we felt like that's a completely different area. It's a very valuable tool in those areas. The only place that we see any real exploitation is in residential property.
Okay, thanks for that clarity.
Committee, are there additional questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative, for your presentation. Do you have, when it talks about the contract for deed to the mortgagee, a lot of times the mortgagee, isn't there some wording in the mortgage that says you can't do this? And do you have to have some acknowledgement back from the person that has the mortgage that you received? I'm just wondering about that part of it, is making sure that when you deal with a mortgage that hasn't been paid off, sometimes you have to, if it's in writing, that you have to, they either won't allow you to do it. That's the ones I've read most of the time. I just wonder how that fits in the picture here.
I'm not exactly sure. I want to make sure I understand the question, but I'll try to answer. I think I think this is another part of the amendment that we did in the House part that says that if there's that there has to be approval from the lending institution has to be involved in the subselling. Is that what you're
Yes, and
asking?
most of the time they won't allow that, is what I remember.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay.
Senator Pittman?
Yeah, if you just read on page 2 in section line 4, it does talk about the seller. It says that the seller shall not execute a contract for deed with a buyer if the seller does not hold the title to property, except as provided further. A seller shall maintain fee simple title to the property free from any mortgage lien or encumbrance. It shall not apply to a mortgage lien or encumbrance placed on the property. And then it goes on to say, as a condition, the seller disclose the contract for deed, the mortgage lien holder or other party of interest, and the seller satisfies and obtains a release of the mortgage lien or other encumbrance not later than the date the buyer makes final payment on the contract of deed. So I think that they have to satisfy that, Senator, but if they choose not to, perhaps that becomes a battle between the seller and the mortgagee. I don't know.
Committee, are there additional questions? Senator Warren?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just want to point out for those following along today, I'm part of the Kansas Judicial Council. It's a 10-member council created by statute. I was not part of Kansas Judicial Council when the ad hoc advisory committee was formed in 2020 to study this issue. And I do note that the Kansas Judicial Council is neutral on this bill. So just wanted to clarify, because sometimes it's misunderstood how the Kansas Judicial Council plays a role, and the advisory committee is different than a committee of the legislature, because legislative committees are made up of Judicial Council members, and advisory committees to the Judicial Council aren't made up of council members. It's others who are put together to advise, and they do so. So thanks for clarifying your role in bringing it to the council in 2020, and just wanted to be clear on what the council's role is on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Representative, I see no more questions, so appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee.
We will now turn our attention to Mark Toom, who is the Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Kansas Association of Realtors. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Mark Toom, Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Kansas Association of Realtors. I also served on the 2020 Judicial Council Study Committee that explored the issues and obviously recognize the need for this legislation. We're here first and foremost as a consumer protection issue. I think that you're seeing a lot of consumer protection issues in the area of real estate. And I think the biggest change and the most important change of this legislation is providing the fact that you have to be hold title to the property to sell it. I think that will eliminate a considerable amount of fraud and abuse. I also think that you're dealing with clientele in this area that are maybe not aware of professional services, either not reaching out assistance from an attorney, a real estate licensee, or a realtor, and there are differences between real estate licensee and realtors. The real estate licensee is somebody who holds a real estate license, and a realtor also holds a real estate license, but also is a member of the association. And with that, you adhere to a code of ethics. So there's additional level of scrutiny if you're involved in a transaction like this with a licensee. You're going to be held to scrutiny with the Kansas Real Estate Commission. And also, if you're a realtor that are dealing with these types of transactions, and you're under additional scrutiny through our code of ethics. And currently, the Real Estate Commission does not have the ability to go after anybody that's not a licensee, so there is a considerable gap in the eyes that look after these types of transactions. And so that's just an important note. But we do support the legislation in its current form and ask that you act favorably on it, and be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Mark, thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, are there questions of Mark? Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mark. In another life, for 8 years, I was a real estate agent and a realtor and part of the association. That was back when conventional loans were 18%. And we had, back in the dark ages, and we also had VA loans that were 15%. And so very difficult. So there was a lot of contract for deeds. That's how people were trying to buy homes back then. I don't know, do we have that much these days? Do we see much of that, especially with mortgage lenders saying you're not allowed to do it?
There are still legitimate uses of contract for deeds. I mean, it's a quick and simple way to eventually transfer to title. It is very used quite often in what was said earlier in the commercial and agricultural fields. In residential, it is probably a little bit more ripe for fraud and abuse, but there are still legitimate uses of a contract for deed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Warren?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mark, for your testimony today. So same question that I asked of the other proponent conferee. What about then the cloud on the title? You've got an affidavit of equitable interest recorded, or you have a contract for deed recorded, and that needs to be cleared up so that private property can pass from one owner to the next, and through no fault of the seller, the buyer has defaulted and isn't paying anymore. So what's your recommendation on that?
I guess I thought that there was a process to cure or be able to address some of the confusion in that process. I mean, you may have to do a legal action to do that, and if there are ideas to strengthen that part of it, we'd certainly be open to that too.
Because right now the bill doesn't provide protection to the other party to this private contract, right? The private seller who's selling his or her property. And so you'd be open to something that would require the buyer, or actually it's not just the buyer, because any person could record the contract for deed or affidavit of equitable interest. You're not saying that anyone could make the affidavit of equitable interest. You're just saying anyone could walk it down to the Register of Deeds office and...
Either side could, and that was a point of disagreement, I think, somewhat of a disagreement in the Judicial Council ad hoc committee, is at some point it should be put on the buyer of the property to register their interest, and it was what part of that, whose side of the transaction they were going to want to make a requirement to do that, and we defaulted to that they should, and it should be an educational campaign to encourage the registering of that.
And what do you mean hold title to the property? I mean, it doesn't specify fee simple, it doesn't...
I believe it does say fee simple.
Well, not in section 3 when it says a seller shall not execute a contract for deed with the buyer if the seller does not hold title to the property.
So again, what is your question then?
What do you mean by does not hold title?
It means that they do not own. We've seen the more fraudulent abuses of this is where they don't have an ownership interest in the property at all, or they're removed several different layers from the actual owner, and they're undertaking these types of arrangements when they have no ownership interest at all in the property.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Committee, additional questions to Mark? I see none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, let me call your attention to neutral written only testimony from Christy Molzen, staff attorney with the Kansas Judicial Council. I have no other proponent testimony, opponent, or neutral testimony on this bill. So we will close the hearing on House Bill 2101. Committee, given that we have some time, I would like to do final action on a few bills that will lighten our load next week. So let's start with House Bill 2561, which was the credit union bill that we heard a couple of weeks ago. Eileen, can you give us a quick review?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. House Bill 2561 would add 3 new sections to the state credit union code. It would allow domestic credit unions to operate outside of the state, provide civil penalties for violations, allow the administrator to enter into informal agreements, remove requirements regarding duplicate filings, establish appeal procedures for suspended credit and supervisory committee members, and require the members of a merged credit union to approve such merger.
Committee, are there questions? Okay, what's the pleasure of the committee? Senator Olson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we pass House Bill 2561 favorable for passage.
Second. Senator Pittman, seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Let's now turn our attention to House Bill 2530, which was the Auto Club bill from the Insurance Department. Committee, as you will see in the balloon that Eileen passed out, the House does not think this is speedy, is not as in a hurry as we are. And so I think this is a very important bill that we need to get enacted. Also, you have a balloon in front of you that would change this enactment date to the Kansas Register. And I would move that amendment. Is there any second? Olson seconds. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. What's the pleasure of the committee on House Bill 2530 as amended? Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that we pass out House Bill 2530 as amended favorably for passage.
Is there a second? Senator Fagg seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Let's now look at House Bill 2531, which is our annual RBC date change bill. Once again, the House doesn't seem to understand the significance of this bill, and so we need to get it enacted as soon as possible. Once again, the balloon that is in front of you just changes the enactment date to the Kansas Register, and I would move that balloon. Is there a second? Senator Gossage, any discussion on the balloon? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. On the amendment, what is the pleasure of the committee on the bill? Senator Gossage.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move that we pass out House Bill number 2531 as amended favorably for passage.
Is there a second on the motion? Olson seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. And the final one for today is House Bill 2532, which deals with work comp pools. Does any committee member wish to have a review on this bill, or is it pretty familiar? We did work it as a Senate bill, the identical bill. So it was the group-funded liability and group-funded work and compensation, changing the reporting requirements from 150 days to 180 days. Would you like for me to brief your bills? Anybody need a refresher? Okay, in front of you, you have a balloon to change this to the Kansas Register. I would move that balloon. Is there a second? Olson seconds. Any discussion on the balloon? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. What is the pleasure of the committee on House Bill 2532 as amended? Senator Olson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we pass House Bill 2532 as amended, favorable for passage.
Is there a second? Senator Fagg seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. House Bill 2532 is headed towards the floor. That completes our work today. Appreciate your attentiveness, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. We're adjourned.